Humiliated in front of everyone for daring to claim what is hers, she silenced the entire room with something no one had the courage to imagine, let alone face. The heavy air of the Lafayette courthouse carried more than the smell of aged paper and waxed wood. On that September morning, an electric tension hung over the main auditorium, where dozens of people crowded to witness what local newspapers were already calling the trial of the century. Rachel Lewis remained seated in the front row, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Her fingers, still marked with scars from years living on the streets, contrasted with the simple but dignified dress the public defender had secured for her to wear at the hearing. Every whisper from the rows behind seemed to pierce her skin like invisible needles. "She doesn't even look like she comes from money," murmured a well-dressed woman in the third row. "Must be a scam for sure," replied the man beside her, adjusting his glasses while observing Rachel with barely disguised contempt. The public defender, Maria Sanders, a young attorney of just 28, nervously flipped through documents spread across the table. This was her first major case, and she knew the eyes of the entire state were on that courtroom. Next to Rachel, she felt the weight of responsibility like a stone on her chest. The case seemed impossible to win, especially with so many irregularities happening behind the scenes. On the other side of the room, prosecutor Charles Reynolds organized his folders with the confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of the story. A heavy-set man with a graying mustache and commanding voice, Reynolds was known for never losing a high-profile case. His eyes scanned the audience like a predator surveying territory, occasionally stopping on Rachel with a smile that never reached his eyes. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Albert Morrison," announced the clerk, and the entire room rose like a human wave. Judge Morrison entered the room with calculated steps, his black robe billowing behind him like a crow's wings. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his expression carried that cold sobriety that usually intimidated even the most experienced attorneys. When his eyes landed on Rachel for a fraction of a second, she could see something that made her shudder, not just indifference, but aversion. "Please be seated," said Morrison, adjusting the papers on his desk with precise movements. "We are here to judge the case that has been moving public opinion for weeks. The defendant, Rachel Lewis, is being prosecuted for multiple crimes related to attempting to inappropriately claim the inheritance of businessman Arthur Anderson, falsely alleging to be his biological daughter." The judge's words echoed through the room like an early sentence. Rachel felt her stomach contract. From the first moment she had stepped into that courthouse, she perceived that this was not a place where truth would be heard, but where a well-rehearsed performance would be presented to the public. Maria Sanders stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "Your Honor, I'd like to make an initial objection. The DNA test confirming my client's parentage was conducted at a reputable laboratory, and—" "Ms. Sanders," interrupted Morrison, without even raising his eyes from the papers, "evidence will be presented in due order. For now, let the prosecutor present the charges." The Ms. Sanders sounded like a slap. Maria swallowed hard and sat back down, feeling the blood rise to her face. Beside her, Rachel remained impassive, but her eyes captured every detail, every expression, every suspicious movement. Charles Reynolds rose with theatrical pomp, adjusting his jacket before addressing the non-existent jury. After all, cases like this were judged solely by the magistrate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the audience and cameras more than the judge, "we are facing one of the most audacious scam attempts this court has ever witnessed. The defendant, Rachel Lewis, spent years living on the streets of our city, observing, studying, planning how to infiltrate the life of the respected businessman Arthur Anderson." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. The prosecutor's words painted a portrait of her as a calculating criminal, a woman without scruples capable of devising elaborate schemes. If she didn't know her own story, she might believe the version being told. "The evidence we will present," continued Reynolds, walking across the room with grandiose gestures, "clearly demonstrates that the defendant used information obtained illicitly to fabricate an alleged family relationship. Documents were falsified, people were deceived, and an elderly, vulnerable man was emotionally manipulated." In the audience, journalists scribbled frantically in their notepads. Some discreet cameras captured Rachel's every expression, every movement of her hands, each time she swallowed hard or shifted position in her chair. Maria Sanders tried to speak up again, Your Honor, the DNA test. The defense will have its opportunity, cut in Morrison without hiding his irritation. Proceed, Mr. Reynolds. The prosecutor smiled, satisfied with the magistrate's tacit support. What impresses me most about this case, he said, approaching the table where Rachel sat, is the coldness with which the defendant executed her plan. Years of preparation, meticulous observation of the victim's habits, creation of a convincing story about abandonment and suffering. Rachel raised her eyes to meet Reynolds' gaze. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. She didn't look away, didn't lower her head, showed no intimidation. There was something in her eyes that made the prosecutor hesitate for a fraction of a second before continuing. I present to the court the first evidence, said Reynolds, turning to his table. Photographs of the defendant living on the street, obtained from shelters and social institutions in the city. Note the date, all prior to the first contact with Mr. Arthur Anderson. The photos were displayed on a large screen. Rachel saw herself there, thinner, dirtier, more desperate, sleeping in doorways, waiting in line at soup kitchens, begging at traffic lights. Each image drew murmurs from the audience, some of compassion, others of contempt. But there was something about the photos that caught Maria Sanders' attention. The dates didn't completely match the reports she had in hand. Some seemed to have been taken out of sequence, and one showed Rachel wearing clothes she had never worn during that period. The defender made a mental note to investigate later. As you can see, continued Reynolds, we have here a woman who knows the reality of the streets very well. A woman who knows how to evoke pity, how to touch the hearts of well-intentioned people. A woman who turned her own tragedy into a weapon. Rachel felt tears burn her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Each word was a distortion of her truth, a deformation of her real pain. She had indeed lived on the streets, had really suffered cold hunger and humiliation, but the reason she had reached that situation was not what they were telling. Judge Morrison observed everything with a satisfied expression. Occasionally he looked at his watch, as if wanting to speed up the process. When Rachel tried to whisper something to her lawyer, he banged his gavel. Silence. The defendant will speak only when directly questioned. But, Your Honor, Maria tried, my client has the right to... Your client has the right to what I determine she has the right to, cut in Morrison, his tone laden with authoritarianism. Proceed, Mr. Reynolds. The morning continued with Reynolds presenting a series of evidence that, although numerous, had a strange pattern. All arrived at the court very conveniently. All perfectly supported the prosecution's narrative, and all lacked details that would allow for deeper verification. I suppose testimony from a shelter worker who claimed to have witnessed Rachel studying newspapers about wealthy businessmen, a phone recording where she allegedly told someone she had found the perfect target, a psychological report describing her as a manipulative personality with sociopathic tendencies. With each piece of evidence presented, Maria Sanders felt the case slipping through her fingers. There wasn't enough time to contest everything, no resources to investigate each document, no space to develop an adequate defense. It was like fighting a 1,000-headed monster with a wooden sword. Rachel, meanwhile, observed every movement, every word, every glance exchanged between judge and prosecutor. There was something orchestrated in it all, something that went beyond a simple trial. It was as if the whole performance was for her, but not about her. When the clock struck noon, Morrison declared a recess. We'll return at 2 o'clock to hear the defense, he said, in a tone suggesting this would be merely a formality. As the room emptied, Rachel remained seated, watching the last journalists leave. Maria gathered her papers with frustrated movements, muttering about the injustice of the process. Counselor, Rachel said softly, do you believe me? Maria stopped what she was doing and looked at her client. There was something in Rachel's eyes that she still couldn't decipher. It wasn't desperation, it wasn't fear. It was almost as if she knew something that everyone else ignored. I need to believe, replied Maria. It's my job. No, said Rachel, rising slowly. I asked if you believe in me, in my story, in my truth. For a moment, the two women stared at each other in silence. In the back of the empty courtroom, their voices echoed like whispers in an abandoned cathedral. Yes, Maria finally said, I believe, but that might not be enough. Rachel smiled for the first time since the trial began. It might be more than enough than you. Imagine, If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The lunch break transformed the corridors of the Lafayette Courthouse into a human anthill. Journalists clustered around small groups, whispering theories and exchanging information like cards in a poker game. Some were already typing their stories on their phones, anticipating the outcome they considered obvious. Maria Sanders managed to reserve a small room to talk with Rachel, away from curious eyes. The environment was claustrophobic. 4 white walls, a scratched wooden table, and 2 uncomfortable chairs. A single window offered a partial view of the street movement, where cars passed indifferent to the drama unfolding a few floors above. "Rachel," Maria began, placing her folder on the table, "I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. And when I say everything, I mean everything. So I can't defend you properly if I don't know the complete truth." Rachel remained silent for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on the window. Her hands, which had remained calm throughout the morning, now trembled slightly. "Counselor, do you have children?" The question caught Maria by surprise. "No, I don't. Why?" "Because it's hard to explain to someone who has never experienced it what it means to grow up knowing you were abandoned. Not rejected, not given up for adoption out of love. Abandoned, left to die." Maria pulled up a chair and sat closer. "Tell me, from the beginning." Rachel took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into deep waters. "I didn't grow up on the streets, counselor. I grew up at St. Francis Home, an orphanage in the metropolitan area of Philadelphia. I was left there as a baby, with no name, no birth certificate, nothing that connected me to an origin." "And how did you discover Arthur Anderson?" "At 18, when I left the orphanage, Sister Claire gave me a box with the few belongings that came with me. Inside was an old faded photograph of a young man embracing a woman. On the back, someone had written, 'Arthur and Catherine, our happiness didn't last long.'" Maria frowned. "And you believed this man was your father based just on that?" "No," said Rachel, shaking her head. "I researched for years. First, I tried to find information about this Catherine. I discovered there was a Catherine Smith, who worked as a secretary at one of the Anderson Group companies in the early 90s. She disappeared from the records in 1992, exactly the year I was born." The defender took frantic notes. This information wasn't included in any of the case documents. "Why didn't you look for Arthur before?" "Because I was a poor girl, nobody's child. Who would believe me? I spent years gathering evidence, working in menial jobs to pay for private investigations. When I finally had the courage to seek him out, I discovered he was going through a very difficult time." "What do you mean?" Rachel hesitated. "Arthur lost his wife 3 years ago. Mrs. Helen was everything to him. Since then, he's been living practically as a recluse, rarely leaving the house, avoiding social commitments. That's when I discovered he was discreetly attending a psychological support center in downtown." "And that's where you met?" "Yes, but not in the way they're portraying. I wasn't there to deceive him. I was there because I needed help too. After years searching for my origins, after so many disappointments and closed doors, I had fallen into depression. I started living on the street because I couldn't keep a job anymore, couldn't believe my life had any purpose." Maria stopped writing and looked at Rachel. There was a sincerity in her voice that was difficult to fake. "And how did you become close?" "It was very natural. Arthur is a kind person, counselor. Very different from what the press portrays. He noticed I was always alone in the group sessions, always quiet. One day he approached and asked if I was okay. We talked. I told him my story, he told me his. We developed a friendship." "And when did you tell him about your suspicion of kinship?" "After 2 months. I was afraid he would think I was getting close out of self-interest. But one night, after a particularly difficult session, he offered me a ride home. When he discovered I didn't have a home, that I was living on the street, he was very disturbed. That's when I showed him the photo and told the whole story." Maria observed Rachel carefully. "And what was his reaction?" "First he was shocked. Then he became emotional. He said he had always suspected he might have children he didn't know about, because he had relationships before marriage that ended abruptly. Catherine was one of them. And the DNA test? It was his idea. Arthur insisted we do the test at a private, discreet laboratory to avoid leaking to the press before we were certain. When the result came confirming paternity, he cried, "Counselor," cried like a child. He said it was the most unexpected gift life could have given him. Maria leaned back in her chair, processing the information. Rachel's version was completely different from the narrative presented by the prosecution. And why did you register the acknowledgement of paternity at the notary's office? Because Arthur wanted to officially give me his surname. Said I had the right to carry the family name. It was all done transparently, with lawyers present, documents signed. There was nothing hidden. So where did these accusations come from? Rachel was silent for a moment. I have a theory, counselor, but you might think it's my paranoia. Tell me. Arthur has a nephew, Matthew Anderson, son of Arthur's younger brother, who died a few years ago. Matthew was always considered the natural heir to the family business, since Arthur had no known children. When my acknowledgement of paternity became official, Matthew was very disturbed. Disturbed how? Arthur told me there was an ugly argument between them. Matthew said it was impossible that I was a blood daughter of the family, that it was obvious I was running a scam. He even hired private investigators to try to prove I was lying. Maria felt a light go on. And you think Matthew might be behind the accusations? Counselor, last night I received an anonymous call. The person said I should give up everything, that it would be better for me to return to the streets and forget this story ever happened. When I asked who was speaking, the person hung up. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I knew you would think it was desperation, an attempt to create a conspiracy theory to defend myself. But there's more, counselor. Much more. Maria leaned forward. What else? Rachel opened her purse and took out a small digital recorder. I know they'll say this is inadmissible, that it was obtained illegally, but I need you to listen. She pressed play. The voice that came out of the device was male, deep, and talking on the phone with someone. The judge is on our side. Morrison will speed up the process and give the verdict we need. Her defense is inexperienced, won't be able to mount a decent strategy in such short time. No, there's no need to do anything drastic. The system is already working in our favor. In a week she goes back to where she belongs and everything returns to normal. Maria felt her blood freeze. Rachel, how did you get this recording? I didn't get it. It was placed in my cell last night without explanation, along with a note that said, "You're not the only person who wants to see justice done." This means someone is helping you. Or someone wants this farce exposed. Counselor, this trial isn't about me. It's about power. It's about keeping things as they've always been. It's about ensuring people like me never have the right to claim their place in the world. Maria looked at the clock. There were 15 minutes until the hearing resumed. Rachel, this recording could change everything, but it could also be a trap. If we present this without being able to prove its authenticity, it could damage our defense even more. I know. But, Counselor, if you listen carefully, you'll notice something. The voice that's speaking, I've heard it before. Where? At the first meeting I had with Arthur's lawyers, when we registered the acknowledgement of paternity. That voice was there. Maria frowned. What do you mean? One of the lawyers present that day made a call during the break. I was in the bathroom, but the walls were thin. I heard him talking with someone about controlling the situation and minimizing damage. At the time, I thought it was about some other case. Now I'm certain it was about me. The defender felt as if pieces of a puzzle were starting to fit together. Rachel, do you know this lawyer's name? Robert Figueroa. He works for the firm that has handled the Anderson family's business for over 20 years. This means that someone within Arthur's own circle is sabotaging our relationship. Someone who has privileged access to family information, who knows the weak points of the judicial system, who can manipulate evidence and influence people. Knocks on the door interrupted the conversation. Ms. Sanders, the hearing will resume in 5 minutes, announced the clerk's voice. Maria quickly put away her notes. Rachel, I'll try to use this information in the best way possible. But you need to be prepared. If we're right about this conspiracy, they won't give up easily. I know, Counselor, but I also know I can't give up on my truth. Not after so long looking for it. The two women walked through the corridors toward the courthouse. The audience was already settling in again, cameras being positioned, journalists sharpening their pencils for what promised to be a revealing afternoon. Rachel stopped at the courtroom door and looked at Maria. Counselor, whatever happens in there, I want you to know. Finding Arthur was the best gift life ever gave me. Discovering I had a father who accepted me, who loved me from the first moment. No one can take that away from me. Not this trial, not these people, not this entire system conspiring against me. Maria smiled. For the first time since taking the case, she felt she wasn't just defending a client. She was fighting for something much bigger. The courtroom fell silent again when Judge Morrison returned to his chair. The afternoon atmosphere seemed heavier than the morning's, as if a storm was approaching. Rachel noticed that some people in the audience had changed places during the break, and new faces appeared among the public. There was something different in the air, a tension she couldn't fully identify. "The floor is with the defense," announced Morrison, looking at Maria Sanders with the same expression of disdain he had maintained since the beginning of the trial. Maria stood up, feeling the weight of all eyes upon her. In her hands, she carried a reorganized folder with new documents and a completely reformulated strategy after the conversation with Rachel. She knew she was about to enter dangerous territory, but there was no alternative. "Your Honor," she began with a firmer voice than she felt, "the defense would like to present a completely different version of the facts. A version based on concrete evidence that was conveniently ignored by the prosecution." Charles Reynolds shifted in his chair, exchanging quick glances with Morrison. The judge drummed his fingers on the table, a gesture that Rachel began to interpret as a sign of impatience. "Proceed, Counselor," said Morrison, ironically emphasizing the correct treatment. "My client is not a criminal, Your Honor. She is a young woman who has spent her entire life searching for her origin, her identity, her family. And when she finally found her biological father, she discovered that the system that should protect her was being used to destroy her." Maria walked to the center of the room, carrying the first document in her hands. "I present to the court Rachel Lewis's original birth certificate, issued by the Civil Registry Office after the spontaneous acknowledgement of paternity made by Arthur Anderson. A legal valid document that unequivocally proves the family bond." "Objection," said Reynolds, rising quickly. "That document is exactly what we're questioning in this process." "Sustained," said Morrison without hesitation. Maria took a deep breath. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the acknowledgement of paternity was done voluntarily, with lawyers present after a DNA test conducted at a reputable laboratory. There is no legal basis to question a legally perfect act." "There is when there's suspicion of fraud," replied the judge. "Then I present the second document," said Maria, removing a folder from the table. "DNA report conducted by Genelab Laboratory in Boston, with international certification. Compatibility of 99.97% paternity between Arthur Anderson and Rachel Lewis." In the audience, some murmurs began to spread. Journalists leaned forward, paying more attention. It was the first time the defense had presented solid evidence. "The report is public knowledge," said Reynolds, trying to minimize the impact. "But the way it was obtained is not," replied Maria. "I'd like to call my first witness, Dr. Frank Carter, Technical Director of Genelab Laboratory." A middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious appearance rose from the audience. Morrison seemed surprised by the witness's presence. "Dr. Carter," began Maria, "can you confirm under what circumstances the DNA test was conducted that proves my client's paternity?" "Yes. The test was personally requested by Mr. Arthur Anderson, who came to the laboratory accompanied by Ms. Rachel. Both provided genetic material in my presence, following all security and authenticity protocols. Was there any sign of coercion or irregularity? None. On the contrary, Mr. Anderson showed positive anxiety about the result. He mentioned he suspected paternity and wanted to confirm it scientifically before taking any legal steps." Reynolds stood up. "Objection. This is hearsay." "Your Honor," said Maria quickly, "Dr. Carter is a direct witness to the facts. He was present during the collection." Morrison hesitated. "Proceed, but stick to the technical facts." "Dr. Carter, is it possible to forge a DNA test?" "Technically, yes, but one would need access to the genetic material of both parties, specialized technical knowledge, and even then, it would be detectable in a counter-expertise. And was there any irregularity in the test conducted?" "None. The procedure rigorously followed international standards. We even keep the samples stored for possible counter-expertise as per protocol." Maria smiled discreetly. "I would like to request that the court order a counter-expertise with oversight by court-appointed experts. The audience stirred. It was a risky move, but one that could definitively confirm Rachel's paternity. "Objection," said Reynolds, clearly nervous. "This would unnecessarily delay the process." "Your Honor," insisted Maria, "if there are doubts about the authenticity of the test, her counter-expertise is the most appropriate procedure to clarify them." Morrison was silent for a few seconds, visibly uncomfortable with the request. "Denied. The process will proceed based on the evidence already presented." The decision caused whispers in the audience. Some journalists exchanged looks of surprise. It was an unusual decision to refuse a counter-expertise in a case of contested paternity. Maria continued, knowing she had scored an important point. "I would now like to question some of the evidence presented by the prosecution this morning." She walked to the screen, where the photos of Rachel in street situations were still projected. "Observe these photographs. The prosecution claims they are all prior to the first contact between my client and Mr. Anderson. However, there are obvious inconsistencies." Maria pointed to one of the photos. "This image shows my client wearing a blue blouse with a cleaning company logo. We have identified that this blouse is a uniform from Cleanwell Company, which only began distributing this specific model in March 2023. The prosecution claims the photo is from January 2023. More murmurs in the audience. Reynolds stood up. "Your Honor, these are irrelevant details that don't alter the substance of the accusation." "Irrelevant," replied Maria. "If there is an error in the dating of fundamental evidence, this questions the entire credibility of the investigation." She pointed to another photo. "And this one shows my client in front of a commercial establishment. In the background you can see a promotional poster. We researched, and that specific promotion occurred only in the second half of 2023, not the first, as the prosecution alleges." Morrison was visibly irritated. "Counselor, present relevant evidence, not analyses of photographic details. These are relevant evidence, Your Honor, because they demonstrate that the timeline presented by the prosecution is false. And if they lied about this, what else did they lie about?" Maria returned to the table and picked up another document. "I now present something the prosecution forgot to mention. The complete report from the shelter where my client stayed, not just the selected parts that were presented this morning." She read aloud. "Rachel Lewis demonstrates introspective, but not manipulative behavior. Participates in community activities, helps other residents, has never been involved in conflicts or inappropriate behaviors, shows signs of depression related to the absence of family bonds." "This is completely different from what was presented this morning," continued Maria. "The prosecution selected only excerpts that supported their narrative, omitting information that contradicted the accusation." Reynolds stood up again. "Your Honor, these documents were obtained legally," interrupted Maria, "through an official request to the shelter, with my client's authorization." It was then that Maria decided to play her riskiest card. "Your Honor, I would like to present evidence that came to the defense's knowledge only today." She removed a transcript from the folder. "This is a recorded conversation where the manipulation of this judicial process is explicitly discussed." The room fell into complete silence. Reynolds visibly paled and Morrison leaned forward. "Objection!" shouted Reynolds. "Clandestine recording has no probative value." "Your Honor," said Maria calmly, "the recording was not made by the defense. It came to us through an anonymous source, possibly someone with direct knowledge of the facts and concerned with justice." "This is inadmissible," insisted Reynolds, clearly nervous. Morrison was visibly disturbed. "Ms. Sanders, immediately present this alleged evidence for analysis." Maria handed the transcript and the recorder to the clerk. "The recording reveals a conversation where there is explicit discussion about how to accelerate this process, influence the judicial decision, and ensure that she goes back to where she belongs." The audience erupted in murmurs. Journalists stirred, cameras turned to capture reactions. It was the first time manipulation in the process had been openly suggested. "This is a farce," said Reynolds, losing his composure. "Her desperate attempt to disrupt the process." "If it's a farce," replied Maria, "I request that a technical analysis of the recording be made. If it's authentic, this court needs to investigate who is behind this conspiracy." Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly. Order in the court." When silence returned, the judge seemed torn between anger and concern. The court will analyze the admissibility of this evidence. For now, the defense may proceed with other arguments. Maria knew she had caused the desired impact. Even if the recording was considered inadmissible, the doubt was planted. "Your Honor, I request that Mr. Arthur Anderson be called to testify. As the alleged victim of the fraud, he has the right to be heard about the facts." "Objection," said Reynolds quickly. "Mr. Anderson has already testified in the inquiry phase." "A testimony of only 15 minutes, replied Maria, "where he could not adequately clarify his version of the facts." Morrison hesitated again. Denying Arthur's testimony would be another sign of bias. "Granted, Mr. Arthur Anderson will be summoned for the next session." Maria returned to the table, satisfied. She had managed to question evidence, introduce doubts about the investigation, and ensure that Arthur could speak. But she knew she had also become a target. Rachel discreetly touched the lawyer's arm when she sat down. "Counselor, you were incredible. But now they're going to try to destroy us completely." "I know," whispered Maria, "but I also know we can't back down now." Morrison ended the session with a somber air. "The trial will continue tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I expect all parties to come prepared for a civilized debate based on legitimate evidence." As the room began to empty, Rachel and Maria remained seated for a few minutes. Around them, journalists animatedly discussed the afternoon's developments. "Counselor," said Rachel softly, "I don't know who put that recording in my cell, but I'm sure this person knows much more than they're revealing." "Why do you think that?" "Because to record that conversation, the person would have to be very close to whoever made it. And to have access to my cell, they would need to have influence within the system. This means our mysterious ally might be closer to us than we imagine. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The early morning in Philadelphia had been hectic behind the scenes of the judicial system. Urgent phone calls were made, improvised meetings happened in luxurious offices, and strategies were quickly reformulated. What should have been a simple and controlled trial was transforming into something much larger and more dangerous for certain interests. Maria Sanders arrived at the Lafayette Courthouse at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before the session's start. She found Rachel already awake in her cell, sitting on the small bed looking out the window with a thoughtful air. During the night, they had exchanged a few words in the corridors when Maria was authorized to make a quick visit. "How are you feeling?" asked Maria, noticing that Rachel seemed more tense than on previous days. "Anxious," admitted Rachel. "Today Arthur will speak. After everything that happened yesterday, I'm afraid of what they might try to do to prevent or discredit his testimony." Maria sat beside her client. "Rachel, I need to tell you something. Last night after I left here, I received a call at my office. The person didn't identify themselves, but said I should be very careful with the next few hours, that there were forces working to ensure this trial ended quickly, one way or another. Do you think it was a threat? It seemed more like a warning, as if someone wanted to prepare me for what's coming." At 8:30, an unusual movement took over the courthouse corridors. Additional security was positioned at the entrances, and journalists reported difficulties accessing areas that were normally open. The atmosphere was different, more tense, as if a special operation was being executed. When 9 o'clock arrived, the auditorium was fuller than on previous days. New faces mingled with the usual public, well-dressed people who didn't seem like mere curious onlookers. Rachel noticed that some of these new spectators looked directly at her with expressions she couldn't decipher. Judge Morrison entered the room with quicker steps than usual, carrying a more voluminous folder. His face showed the tension of someone who had spent a difficult night. As he sat down, he cast a penetrating look at Maria Sanders, as if she represented a problem that needed to be solved. "Before we begin," announced Morrison, "I'd like to inform that the recording presented yesterday by the defense was analyzed by a judicial expert during the night. The preliminary report indicates possible signs of editing and digital manipulation." Maria immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I request to see the expert report and time to present an independent technical opinion." Denied. "The report is conclusive for the purposes of this process." The response came too quickly, too automatically. In the audience, some journalists exchanged looks of surprise. It was unusual for an expert report to be concluded in so few hours, especially dealing with complex digital analysis. Your Honor, insisted Maria, with all due respect, audio authenticity analyses require time and specialized equipment. A report produced in a few hours. Ms. Sanders, cut in Morrison, his tone laden with authoritarianism. The court has its procedures and deadlines. Let's proceed with the witness testimony. It was then that the courtroom doors opened and Arthur Anderson entered the room. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. The businessman, who rarely appeared in public since the loss of his wife, walked with firm steps carrying a presence that naturally commanded respect. His grey hair was perfectly combed, his suit was impeccable, but his eyes revealed a determination that few had seen before. When Arthur looked at Rachel, their faces lit up mutually with a discreet smile, but laden with genuine affection. It was a father and daughter moment that the cameras captured, and that would be reproduced in all the country's news outlets. "Mr. Arthur Anderson," said the clerk, "do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?" "I swear," replied Arthur with a clear and firm voice. Charles Reynolds stood up to ask the first questions, visibly nervous. "Mr. Anderson, do you confirm that you were approached by the defendant, Rachel Lewis?" "No," replied Arthur calmly. "We met in a psychological support group. There was no approach from either side. It was a natural encounter." The answer caught Reynolds by surprise. He quickly consulted his notes. "But don't you find it suspicious that a homeless person was attending the same group as you?" "Sir to prosecutor," said Arthur, with a tone that carried decades of experience in difficult negotiations. "People in situations of emotional vulnerability come from all social classes. Pain doesn't choose bank accounts." In the audience, some murmurs of approval spread. It was the first time someone had directly countered the prejudiced narrative that had been constructed. "Do you maintain that the defendant is your biological daughter?" "I not only maintain it, I'm absolutely certain. And more than that, I'm proud of her." The declaration caused a visible impact in the room. Rachel felt tears burn her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Reynolds tried a new approach. "Mr. Anderson, don't you consider that you might have been emotionally manipulated, taking advantage of a moment of fragility?" Arthur leaned forward, fixing his gaze on the prosecutor. "Mr. Reynolds, I built a business empire. I negotiate with politicians, middlemen, disloyal competitors. Do you really think a young woman in a vulnerable situation could manipulate me? But you admit you were going through a difficult time. I was in a period of mourning, not mental incapacity. And meeting Rachel was the greatest blessing I've received in years. She didn't ask me for anything. Not money, not recognition, not help. Just friendship. It was I who insisted on the DNA test when she told me her story." Maria Sanders observed every word, every gesture. Arthur was being absolutely sincere, and this was evident to anyone in the room. "Mr. Anderson," continued Reynolds, clearly losing ground, "are you aware that there are people close to your family who question this paternity?" "I am. And I know exactly who they are and why they question it." The answer caught Reynolds unprepared. "Can you explain?" Arthur took a deep breath. "My nephew Matthew has always considered himself my natural heir. When I recognized Rachel as my daughter, he was disturbed. He even came to me suggesting I was being deceived. And what did you respond to him? That DNA doesn't lie. And that even if it did, I would choose Rachel as my daughter anyway, because she demonstrated more character in 2 months of coexistence than many people in my own family have in decades." The room fell into complete silence. It was an explosive declaration that highlighted the family conflicts behind the whole situation. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Anderson, stick to the facts related to the accusation." "Your Honor," said Arthur, turning to the judge, "the facts related to the accusation include the motivations of those behind it." It was Maria Sanders' turn to question. "Mr. Anderson, are you aware of any external pressure or influence for this process to be initiated?" "I am. 3 days before the accusations were formalized, I received a visit from attorney Robert Figueroa, who has worked for my family for years. He suggested to me that it would be better for everyone if I reconsidered the recognition of Rachel." "And what was your response?" "I told him he was fired." A buzz spread through the audience. Reynolds quickly stood up. Objection. This has no relation to the process. It has a direct relation, replied Maria. It demonstrates there was interest in preventing the recognition of paternity for reasons that have nothing to do with the alleged fraud. Morrison hesitated before speaking. Proceed with questions related to the facts. Mr. Anderson, continued Maria, did you make the acknowledgement of paternity freely and consciously? Absolutely. And I'd like to add something. The day I met Rachel, even before knowing she might be my daughter, I found her a special person. She had an inner strength, a dignity that impressed me. When I discovered our family relationship, I wasn't surprised. I recognized in her characteristics I knew in myself. Would you maintain the recognition even in the face of all this pressure? I would and I do. Rachel is my daughter in blood, in heart, and in law. And nothing and no one will change that. Arthur then turned to Rachel, breaking protocol. Daughter, I'm sorry you're going through this, but I want you to know that I'm here, I'll always be here, and we'll face this together. Morrison banged his gavel. Mr. Anderson, address only the court. But it was too late. The image of father and daughter looking at each other with love and mutual support had been captured by all the cameras present. It was a moment that no manipulation could undo. When Reynolds tried to ask more questions to discredit the testimony, Arthur responded with confidence and coherence to all of them. It became increasingly clear that there was no doubt in his mind about the paternity, nor about his intention to keep Rachel as his recognized daughter. One last question, Mr. Anderson, said Maria. Do you have any suspicion about who might be orchestrating these accusations? Arthur looked directly at her. I have more than suspicions. I have certainties. And I have proof. The room exploded in murmurs. Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly. Order. What proof? Asked Maria. Arthur smiled for the first time since entering the room. Counselor, I didn't get where I am in life by being naive. When I realized there was a conspiracy against my daughter, I took some precautions. He made a gesture and a man rose from the audience, walking toward the defense table carrying a leather briefcase. Your Honor, said Arthur, I request permission to present evidence I've collected in recent days, evidence that will show who is really behind this farce. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Morrison seemed to have completely lost control of the situation. The man who approached the defense table was Carlos Montgomery, a private investigator with more than 20 years of experience and an impeccable reputation in Philadelphia's business community. He placed the leather briefcase on the table carefully, as if carrying explosives. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the sound of the latches being opened echoed throughout the room. Morrison was visibly disturbed. Mr. Anderson, this court was not informed about these supposed pieces of evidence. Your Honor, replied Arthur calmly. The evidence was collected legally through private investigation. After discovering my daughter was the target of a conspiracy, I have the right to present it in my defense. Charles Reynolds quickly stood up, sweat visible on his forehead. Objection. Evidence cannot be presented without prior analysis. The prosecution presented questionable evidence without giving adequate time for defense analysis, replied Maria Sanders. Now the same courtesy should be extended. Carlos Montgomery removed from the briefcase a series of documents organized in labeled folders. Mr. Anderson, he said, addressing both the businessman and the court, may I present the results of the investigation? Morrison hesitated. Denying the presentation of evidence at that moment would be a clear sign of bias before an audience that included journalists from national media outlets. Proceed, said the judge, clearly displeased. Montgomery opened the first folder. During the last 15 days, at Mr. Arthur Anderson's request, we investigated the origins of the accusations against Ms. Rachel Lewis. What we discovered was a coordinated operation involving multiple people with the objective of nullifying the acknowledgement of paternity. He removed a sheet from the folder. First document, service contract between Matthew Anderson and the private investigation company Anchor Security, dated 1 day after the official acknowledgement of Ms. Rachel's paternity. Value, $200,000 to investigate irregularities related to alleged daughter of Arthur Anderson. The audience murmured. Rachel looked at Arthur, who gave her a reassuring nod. Montgomery continued. Second document, Email exchange between Matthew Anderson and attorney Robert Figueroa, discussing strategies to reverse the problem of the bastard. Textual words from the email. Some journalists leaned forward, making frantic notes. The term bastard caused visible indignation in the audience. Third document, continued the investigator, bank transfer receipt of $50,000 from Matthew Anderson's personal account to an offshore account, made 2 days before the formal accusations began. Reynolds stood up again. Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the case. Very relevant, replied Montgomery, because the offshore account belongs to a consulting firm specialized in manipulating judicial evidence. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly, but the agitation was out of control. And here, said Montgomery, removing an envelope from the folder, we have the most compelling proof. He opened the envelope and removed a series of photographs. These images were obtained through security cameras of commercial establishments near the courthouse. They show prosecutor Charles Reynolds meeting with Robert Figueroa at the Lobos Villa restaurant 2 days before the trial began. The photographs circulated through the room. It was clearly possible to see Reynolds and Figueroa sitting at the same table, with documents spread between them. This proves nothing, exclaimed Reynolds, completely losing his composure. I can meet with anyone. True, agreed Montgomery. But we also have this. He removed a small digital recorder. Recording legally obtained through a directional microphone during the meeting. The Lobos Villa restaurant has outdoor tables in a public space. Morrison was pale. This is legal, completed Maria Sanders. Recording in public space does not constitute a violation of privacy. Montgomery pressed play. The voice that came out of the device was unmistakably that of Charles Reynolds. Judge Morrison is with us. He will speed up the process and give the verdict we need. Her defense is inexperienced. Won't be able to mount a decent strategy in such short time. The important thing is that everything appears legal, within procedures. Robert Figueroa's voice replied, and if she presents compelling evidence? We've already taken care of that. Any evidence she brings will be technically questioned. We have experts who will contest everything. And the DNA test? Also will allege fraud in the procedure. Matthew is already preparing documents that show how she could have manipulated the samples. The room was in complete silence, absorbing every word. When the recording ended, all eyes turned to the prosecutor and the judge. Reynolds was visibly trembling. This is a montage. Digital manipulation. Mr. Prosecutor, said Montgomery calmly. The recording was made with professional equipment and can be submitted to any technical expertise you wish. Morrison rose from his chair, clearly trying to find a way out. This court cannot accept evidence obtained in a legal manner, interrupted Arthur, also standing up. Completely legal, and there's more. Montgomery removed a final document from the briefcase. Financial report, showing suspicious movements in the accounts of people involved in the process, including significant deposits in the personal accounts of prosecutor Charles Reynolds, made by companies linked to Matthew Anderson. The information was the final blow. Reynolds staggered, leaning on the table. The courtroom was in complete tumult, with journalists speaking on the phone, cameras focusing on reactions, and the public commenting animatedly. Your Honor, said Maria Sanders, seizing the moment, I request the immediate suspension of this process and the opening of an investigation into the irregularities exposed here. Morrison was clearly in panic. I need to analyze. This requires... It was then that a voice echoed from the back of the room. It requires nothing more than justice. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was a middle-aged, well-dressed woman who stood up from the last row. She walked determinedly toward the front of the room. I am Helen Cardoso, former secretary of the law firm Figueroa and Associates. I came here today to testify that I personally witnessed several of the conversations mentioned in these recordings. The woman stopped in the center of the room, looking directly at Morrison. I have in my possession copies of all emails exchanged between Robert Figueroa, Matthew Anderson, and other people involved in this conspiracy, including messages that show how they intended to influence this trial. Morrison tried to regain control. Ma'am, you cannot. Simply, yes, I can, interrupted Helen. as a citizen and as a witness to crimes against the administration of justice. And I didn't come alone. She made a gesture and 3 more people rose from the audience. A man identified himself as an employee of the laboratory, where the alleged expert report on the recording had supposedly been made during the night. "Judge Morrison," said the man, "I am Richard Alves, technical manager responsible for the report you cited this morning. I came to clarify that no such report exists. No analysis was done in our laboratory in the last 48 hours. The revelation caused new commotion. Morrison had blatantly lied about the existence of the expert report." A second person identified herself as an employee of the notary's office, where the acknowledgement of paternity had been registered, confirming that the entire procedure was done according to the law, without any irregularity. The third person introduced himself as a former employee of the investigation company hired by Matthew, bringing documents that proved the instructions received to fabricate convincing evidence against Rachel. The courtroom was completely out of control. Morrison tried to bang his gavel, but his authority had completely dissolved. Reynolds remained seated, head down, clearly defeated. "Your Honor," said Maria Sanders, with a firm and clear voice, "in light of all the evidence presented, I request not only the immediate acquittal of my client, but also that an inquiry be ordered to investigate the crimes of corruption, malfeasance, and conspiracy exposed here." Arthur approached Rachel and, for the first time during the entire trial, she allowed herself to cry. But they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of justice finally being done, of truth being revealed. "Daughter," said Arthur softly, embracing her, "it's over. It's all over." Rachel looked at him through the tears. "Dad, how did you manage all this?" Arthur smiled. "Because when you have a daughter to protect, you move mountains. And because I learned a very important thing in my years of business, always have a backup plan." In the audience, journalists were already broadcasting the events live. In a few hours, the story would be in all the country's news outlets. How a young woman who had spent her life searching for her family faced a corrupt system and won, with the help of the father she had never known, but who had loved her from the first moment. Morrison, realizing his position was untenable, muttered something about suspending the session to analyze the new evidence. But everyone knew the trial was decided. The truth had prevailed, and with it, justice. 3 months after what the national press came to call the trial of truth, Philadelphia woke up to a headline that occupied the front page of all newspapers. "Justice confirmed. Rachel Lewis is officially recognized as legitimate heir." The case had become a landmark in the fight against judicial corruption and a symbol that truth, even when attacked by powerful forces, always finds its way. On that sunny December morning, Rachel sat in the garden of the Anderson family mansion, in one of the city's most upscale neighborhoods. Her hair, now well cared for and cut by a professional hairdresser, shone under the sun. She wore a light blue dress, simple but elegant, and on her fingers shone a ring with the family crest, a gift that Arthur had given her the day she moved into the house. "Daughter, are you ready?" asked Arthur, approaching with a radiant smile. At 72, he seemed to have rejuvenated a decade since Rachel entered his life. His eyes, once burdened by the sadness of widowhood, now shone with a joy he hadn't felt for years. "Ready for what, Dad?" asked Rachel, still getting used to the naturalness of calling him that. "To meet your new life. Today we're going to the company. It's time for you to start learning about the family business." Rachel smiled, but there was a certain melancholy in her eyes. "Dad, sometimes I still don't believe all this is real. That I really have a family, a home, a place in the world." Arthur sat beside her on the garden bench. "I understand, daughter. You spent so much time searching for your origin that now you need to get used to having found it. But I want you to know something. You always had a place in the world. You just didn't know where it was. And Matthew? Have you heard anything about him?" Arthur's face darkened slightly. "Matthew is facing the consequences of his choices. He was indicted for conspiracy and active corruption. Robert Figueroa, too. As for former Judge Morrison and former prosecutor Reynolds," he paused, "they are facing charges for malfeasance and passive corruption. Justice is being done." Rachel nodded. Although she knew justice was necessary, she felt no joy in the misfortune of others. "And Maria? How is she?" "Our Ms. Maria Sanders is doing very well. The case projected her nationally. She's receiving invitations from important law firms across the country. But she told me she'll continue working as a public defender. She said she wants to help other people like you. She's a special person. Like you, daughter. Like you. Father and daughter remained silent for a few minutes, watching the birds flying through the garden. It was a comfortable silence, of people who had found each other and knew they would never lose each other again. "Dad," said Rachel finally, "can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, daughter. We're family now. Families share secrets." "During the whole trial, I knew we would win." Arthur looked at her in surprise. "How so?" "I can't really explain it. It was a feeling, as if a greater force was taking care of us, as if Mom was protecting us." Arthur's eyes filled with tears. "Catherine, your mother. You've told me very little about her." Arthur took a deep breath. "Catherine was the bravest woman I've ever known. Intelligent, determined, full of life. When I discovered she was pregnant, I was desperate with happiness. But the families didn't approve of our relationship. She was poor, I was rich. There was pressure from all sides for us to separate. And what happened? She disappeared. Simply vanished. I looked for her for months, but it was as if she had evaporated. Now I understand that she must have gone away to protect me, to protect you from the family pressure. She left me at the orphanage to protect me. I'm sure of that. And I'm sure that if she were alive, she would have been proud of the strong and brave woman you've become." Rachel leaned on her father's shoulder. "Dad, thank you." "For what, daughter?" "Fellatry, my..." "For accepting me. For fighting for me. For giving me a family. I'm the one thanking you. For giving me purpose again. For bringing light back into my life." At that moment, Helen Cardoso, the former secretary who had testified at the trial, approached carrying a tray with coffee. Arthur had hired her as the house administrator, recognizing her courage and integrity. "Mr. Anderson, Ms. Rachel, coffee is served." And a letter arrived for the young lady. Rachel picked up the envelope with curiosity. When she opened it, she found a letter from an 18-year-old girl from Boston who had followed the trial on television. The letter said, "Dear Rachel, my name is Amy Peters and I'm also an orphan. I watched your entire trial on TV and wanted to say that you gave me hope. Hope that I too can find my family. Hope that people like us don't always have to accept injustice. You are my heroine. Thank you for showing me that it's worth fighting for the truth." Rachel showed the letter to Arthur, who smiled with pride. "Daughter, you've become a symbol of hope for many people. It's strange to think about that. I just wanted to find my family. And you found it. But in the process, you helped other people believe they can find theirs too." During the following weeks, similar letters arrived from all over the United States. Young orphans, people who had been adopted and were searching for their origins, victims of injustices in the system. Rachel's story had touched the heart of the entire country. 3 months later, in an emotional ceremony at the notary's office where it all began, Rachel signed the documents that officially made her co-heir of Anderson Enterprises. Maria Sanders was present, as were Helen Cardoso and several other people who had helped in the fight for truth. "Ms. Rachel," said the notary, "the same one who had registered the original acknowledgement of paternity, now everything is official. You are legally recognized as the daughter and heir of Arthur Anderson." Rachel signed the documents with steady hands. When she finished, she looked at Arthur. "Dad, I have a proposal." "What is it, daughter?" "I want to create a foundation to help young orphans find their families, and also to offer free legal support for people facing injustices like the one we faced." Arthur smiled with pride. "Catherine would have been very proud of you." "The Catherine Lewis Foundation," said Rachel. "To honor my mother and help other people find their place in the world." "Approved," said Arthur, hugging his daughter. "Totally approved." 6 months later, the Catherine Lewis Foundation had already helped more than 100 people reunite with their families. Rachel's case had inspired changes in legislation on adoption and the search for family origins. Maria Sanders became the foundation's legal coordinator, working part-time to continue her career as a public defender. On a June afternoon, father and daughter were again seated in the garden of the house, observing the movement of the city below. Rachel now directed one of the divisions of the family business and showed herself to be as talented in business as her father. "Dad," she said, "do you remember what you said the first day we met in the support group?" What was that? That sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them. I remember. And I was right, wasn't I? Very right. I spent my entire life looking for you, and when I finally stopped searching, you appeared. And I spent 3 years thinking my life was over when Helen died, and then you appeared to show me it was just beginning a new phase. Rachel stood up and kissed her father's forehead. I love you, Dad. I love you too, daughter, forever. As the sun set over Philadelphia, painting the sky in golden and orange hues, Rachel thought about all the people who were still searching for their families, for their truth, for their place in the world. She thought about the letters that still arrived, about the cases the Foundation was helping to resolve, about the lives that were being transformed. Her story had begun with abandonment and loneliness, but ended with love and belonging. And most importantly, it had become a bridge for other people to find the same.